I'm Dr. G4, and you're listening to the Beginner's Guide to Model Railroading, the exuberantly opinionated atlas of the basic techniques for the world's greatest hobby. This is BGT Episode 27, Mid-Atlantic Class 3s and Narrow Gauge Railroads. In this episode, I'll finally close out the railroad history of the Mid-Atlantic region. Picking this back up from just a bit too long ago, I've obviously had quite a lot to say on the proto-future front as of late, but never fear, I'm back and have a few more BGT scripts written for you in the coming months. Main sequence BGT episodes will likely be finished in just a few episodes, but I'll keep going through the major railroad history every now and again. Someday I might branch out to Canadian railroads and then possibly abroad, but that's many episodes down the line, so no guarantees. Anyway, for now, let's finish up the Mid-Atlantics by looking at the Class 3s, short lines, and narrow gauge railroads. As always, a disclaimer, these episodes require a huge amount of research and any individual statement should be fact-checked. Finally, moving away from the anthracite roads and regionals too, we can now discuss the odds and ends, starting with one of the tiniest and most famous names in all of railroading, the Maryland and Pennsylvania. The Ma&Pa, as it was affectionately known, was a very small regional line between Baltimore, Maryland and York, Pennsylvania that was proximate enough to big East Coast cities to be documented by early rail fans and historians from the 1930s onward, most preeminently by the gay couple Lucius Beebe and Charles Clegg in their seminal book Mixed Train Daily. The Ma&Pa was exceptionally beloved for its positively primordial equipment and scenic, meandering, practically useless route of 120 kilometers over a straight line distance of only 70. Originally formed as two separate railroads, the Baltimore and Lehigh and York and Peach Bottom, construction began amidst the narrow gauge fever of the late 19th century and was thus set to 3-foot gauge. From the name Baltimore and Lehigh, plans were initially grandiose. The outcome, not quite so much. The Peach Bottom Railway started in 1871, having laid track between York, Red Line, and Delta, Pennsylvania by 1876. In 1881, the B&L was formed, and by 1883, it spanned between Baltimore and the Pennsylvania State Line at Delta. A few reorganizations later, and in 1901, both railroads merged to span clear from Baltimore to York, making the Ma&Pa. As part of the merger, the two standard gauged, finally allowing interchange with surrounding railroads, which proved to be a major boon given its common carrier status. Unfortunately, its narrow-gauge routes hung around in the form of flange-squealingly tight curves, one of the main reasons why the Ma&Pa is popular as a modeling subject for small layouts. Another is that the Ma&Pa's traffic was an absolute dog's breakfast, hauling marble, coal, wood, crafted goods, and foods to market, as well as so much milk it was once called the Milky Way, in addition to, of course, people, mail, and express. For a while, the line was quite profitable and even owned over a dozen locomotives at once. However, automobility hit the Ma&Pa early and hard. Its slow, sharp, circuitous route, very small workaday cargo loads, and otherwise very short distance to Baltimore made it preternaturally susceptible to competition from early trucking. The 20s were harsh, the 30s were harsher. Some of this was offset by a shift from less than carload traffic to carload traffic like gravel, but that could only do so much amidst the faltering economy and terribly, harshly unfair government preference of trucking and automobility in the form of paved roads, without a concomitant taxpayer subsidy to railroads for right-of-way maintenance. In the 1930s, though, much like the main two-footers, the Ma&Pa found an alternative source of revenue, railfan excursions. The budding rail preservation movement in major nearby cities could recognize that the railroad was something special, but was also likely moribund, so they made to savor it while they still could. When the last revenue passenger train ran in 1956, people came from as far away as Boston to ride. In the 1940s, the Ma&Pa acquired a few diesel locomotives, and the last steam locomotive was retired by 1956. Traffic redlined in the post-war years, and the Maryland half was fully abandoned about the same time, making it, I guess, just the and-Pa. In 1978, it was cut yet again between Red Line and York to a meager 14 kilometers. However, interestingly, as it shrank, it started to morph from an old-fashioned branch line into a new-fashioned switching shortline logistics company. It solicited additional online industries as best it could, and in 1976, it bought a former Pennsy branch from the Penn Central between York and Hanover. Sometime about then, it was acquired by the Emmons Company, and in 1999, it was merged with another nearby Emmons shortline to form the York Railway. In 2002, now back up to about 70 kilometers and serving 40 customers, years, ownership was transferred to the famed Genesee and Wyoming, one of the largest and most successful shortline railroad conglomerates in the world. Elements of the Ma&Pa still exist, one segment under the stewardship of a historical society near Muddy Creek Forks, and another near Baltimore Penn Station operated by the Baltimore Streetcar Museum. And an even tinier blip is still a part of the York Railway in downtown York, Pennsylvania. Much of the modern Baltimore light rail even parallels the original route, leading to a fitting juxtaposition of old and new. While it didn't beat the Baltimore and Ohio for the first railroad in the United States, the first railroad chartered in the United States was the New Jersey Railroad Company in 1815, intended for construction between Trenton and New Brunswick. While this was well into the canal era, for some reason the state decided to charter and finance both a canal and a railroad, parallel to each other but controlled by separate companies. New Jersey already had an extensive canal network at the time, and it seems nothing much came of the railroad, and it was soon folded into the Canal Company. Enter the Camden and Amboy. Chartered in 1830 and in direct competition with the Delaware and Raritan Canal Company, the goal was to bridge the gap between Philadelphia on the Delaware and the Raritan River, which had connections to New York. This was only just as the B&O was getting going, so at the time, common carrier railroads were still considered a new and untested business model. After negotiating with the state to get the railroad charter from the canal, the CNA started construction from Bordentown, New Jersey on the Delaware, and almost immediately the Camden and Amboy absorbed the D&R Canal Company. Robert Stephenson and Company of England, not to be confused with the president of the CNA, Robert Stevens, built a locomotive in Liverpool for the CNA in 1831, the John Bull, and shipped it to Bordentown, New Jersey. This locomotive, having steamed up in 1981 to celebrate its 150th anniversary, became the oldest operating steam locomotive in the world, and it currently resides at the Smithsonian Institution on static display in Washington, D.C. Service began in 1832 between a wharf on the Delaware near Bordentown with ferry connections to Philly and Hightstown, New Jersey, about 20 kilometers away. The rest of the route opened later that year to South Amboy at the very edge of the New York harbor near the southernmost point of Staten Island. A year later still, the line was extended south, halving the distance to Philly, and in 1834 the line reached Camden, right across the river from the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection. Profits rolled in almost immediately, despite having the earliest railroad accident resulting in the loss of life of 2 passengers. This may not quite have been an eschere, but it was significant for the time. Around this time, the New Jersey Railroad and Transportation Company was formed with the intention of competing with the CNA as a parallel route. Starting much closer to New York, just across the river in Jersey City, the NJRR bought up a few local turnpike companies to get a good route through Newark, but stopped its southward march short of New Brunswick. Instead of competing, the CNA built a branch to New Brunswick to connect with it, opening in 1838. Interestingly, the NJRR continued to build south, and the CNA amended its charter to instead connect with it via a new branch at Trenton, then building northeastward towards the NJRR's new terminus, effectively building a windier version of the modern Northeast Corridor. Amongst all these shenanigans, a third railroad company entered the mix, the Philadelphia and Trenton, crossing the Delaware at Trenton to connect with the CNA in 1839, after which the P&T and the CNA began cooperating. When the full route was open, a one-seat ride could be taken between, the outskirts of New York City and, the outskirts of Philadelphia, although most traffic continued to Camden due to its better proximity to Center City, Philly. In the late 1850s and early 1860s, the CNA actually did capitalism properly and reinvested its profits into the route, straightening it and improving it into what is now the Northeast Corridor's busiest single segment. In 1863, the route improvements were finished, allowing travel from Trenton to New Jersey in as little as only 150 minutes. By comparison, today's travel time is 80 minutes. Further still, the line was double-tracked in 1864. The original route remained for a bit as a freight bypass, but it was cut back and replaced with a Princeton branch, the route of the modern namesake Dinky. During the 1850s and 60s, a flurry of other railroads were built in the area. The Paterson and Hudson River, Morris and Essex, and Newark and New York railroads, all for a time using the NJRR's tracks before building their own in competition. The CNA was able to legally protect its New York to Philly monopoly until 1876, but played along with the frenzy, buying, building, and selling a ton of other branch lines in the region along the way. As time progressed, these railroads were bought up by bigger railroads with more national ambitions. The Paterson and Hudson River was bought by the Erie, the Morris and Essex became the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, the Newark and New York, the Central Railroad of New Jersey. The Camden and Amboy was no stranger to this, being leased by the United New Jersey Railroad and Canal Company in 1867 and being effectively subsumed by the behemoth Pennsylvania Railroad in 1871. The CNA actually maintains a legacy of passenger railroading in New Jersey. A century later, with the failure of Penn Central and the disinterest of Conrail, the state of New Jersey took over the route of the old CNA. Not only did its main line become the backbone of the most densely traveled rail corridor in the Western Hemisphere, but intercity passenger trains were revived on its original main line in 2004 from Camden to Trenton via Bordentown in the form of New Jersey Transit's River Line, a diesel multiple-unit hybrid light rail transit. Not to be confused with the other M&E, the Morris and Essex, the Morris Town and Erie started life as the Whippany Railroad in 1895, with the intent to connect Whippany with an interchange on the DL&W at Morristown 10 kilometers away. After some initial debt issues, the railroad set to expansion in 1902 to connect with the Erie and Essex Falls 12 kilometers further, thereby offering the many online paper mills some choice in whether they consigned their freight. Passenger service ended rather early in 1928, but freight trundled along. Aggressive cost-cutting kept it alive through the Depression, and interestingly, the M&E was the only railroad in the country to rid itself of all debt prior to World War II. Afterwards, however, many of the line's mill customers consolidated through the 1950s, and the merger of the Erie and DL&W into the Erie-Lackawanna eliminated competitive shipping rates. The M&E started buying diesels in 1952 to lighten operating costs, but the northeastern manufacturing recession of the 1970s closed the last of the mills on the line. However, the railroad hung on long enough to see the revival of railroading. In 1982, a group of local business people led by Benjamin Friedland purchased the M&E and set about rehabilitating it. Track was improved, locomotives repaired, and local industries were insistently marketed to. Much as with the Grafton and Upton, this was a time of shortline revival, advertising shortlines not as last-mile transit services, but as a logistics contractor and business amenity like you would find in any dedicated industrial park, just one that's significantly bigger and spans multiple towns. Buoyed by their success, they acquired the new-to-them Chester branch in 1983 and purchased several branches of the Central Railroad of New Jersey in 1986, including the famed High Bridge branch. Improving their adaptability, the M&E also opened the Whippany Railroad Museum in 1985 and briefly operated the New Hope and Ivyland Tourist Railroad in the late 80s. 1995 brought switching operations to the Bayway Refinery, one of the largest on the East Coast. The M&E's growth was so spectacular that the death of Benjamin Friedland in 1998 led the New Jersey Shortline Railroad Association to name an award in his honor for meritorious service to the shortline industry. Due to its success, the M&E was selected by Union County in 2001 to build and rehabilitate former segments of the Staten Island Railway and Rahway Valley Railway for 10 years. In 2003, it briefly did similarly for both SEPTA with the Octorara Railroad for 1 year, and the state of Maine with the former Maine Central Railroad Rockland branch for 13. The M&E also redoubled its heritage creds by running tourist trains for a time on the Rockland branch, the Stourbridge line in Honesdale, Pennsylvania, and even a mainline excursion from its own Hoboken terminal to Bethlehem in 2013 to celebrate its 110th birthday. It even regularly hosts filming locations for various movies and TV shows out of the Whippany Railroad Museum. Many of these operations were temporary. In 2016, Rockland Branch operation defaulted to the state of Maine and was then purchased by Canadian Pacific in 2020, and in 2017, the former CNJ and Chester branches were ceded to the Dover and Rockaway River Railroad, named for one of the ex-CNJ branches it was taking over. Nowadays, the M&E interchanges with Norfolk Southern, CSX, and Conrail shared assets, and has trackage rights over most of New Jersey transit lines for freight and interchange operations, so much so that all of its locomotives are equipped with NJT standard in-cab signaling. An out-of-the-way but well-known shortline is the Winchester and Western Railroad. Originally opened in 1918, it extended creatively enough from Winchester, Virginia, westward into the Shenandoah Mountains to provide timber to a tie mill for the Baltimore, Ohio, and United States military during World War I. Initially, the B&O, which owned the tie mill, intended for a narrow-gauge line, but the contracted construction company chose standard gauge instead. After reaching Gore, Virginia, a Golden Spike ceremony was held at the Capon Springs Resort in 1919. This, however, was premature, with the railroad being extended to its westwardmost terminus of Wardensville, West Virginia in 1921. Reflecting its primarily freight focus, the W&W had extremely limited passenger service. A theme which we will see recurring quite a bit more in the future for shortline railroads, the primary passenger service was a literal automobile bus with tires swapped for flanged steel wheels and the steering wheel locked. The railbus made 2 round trips a day, mostly serving resort-bound passengers. Later, several other rail buses supplemented the fleet, though not with much improvement to the schedule. Occasional excursion trains were chartered out of Winchester to view the incredible scenery of the West Virginia mountains. Briefly, during the 1920s, 3 narrow-gauge lines extended further from Wardensville, but these went belly up with the Depression. With the loss of the connecting lines and the exhaustion of the local timber supply, the W&W was cut back in 1934 to the Capon Springs Resort, then several more times until re-reaching Gore in 1944, stopping the rollback due to local sand mines. Despite a few reorganizations, it remained independent of larger railroads for a nice 69 years. After remaining largely static, it benefited from Conrail's jettisoning of branch lines by buying an old Pennsylvania route from Winchester northeastward to Hagerstown in 1986, significantly extending its main line, as well as some lines in southern New Jersey opening up a new division. After developing into a modern shortline success story, it was purchased by the Omnitrax conglomerate in 2019. Nowadays, it primarily serves Unaman mines and local agricultural traffic. The Tuckerton Railroad is a very small affair operating entirely in southern New Jersey. Founded in 1871 by locals, it was built to connect the coastal community of Tuckerton with the Central Railroad of New Jersey. It was built with lightweight rail and two small 440s from the CNJ interchange at the south central town of Whittings through the Pine Barrens and towards the coast at Waretown, then along the shore down to Tuckerton and a steamship moorage for continuing trips to Long Beach Island. Very shortly after opening, another small railroad was built from the midpoint at Waretown back up to the CNJ via another route effectively paralleling service, though this route was briefly operated by the Tuckerton. In 1881, the Pennsy built a line from Philadelphia to the northern segment of Long Beach Island, also connecting with the Tuckerton at Whittings. Due to the reliance on larger railroads, various plans were floated over the years to extend the Tuckerton to Trenton or near Camden, but nothing materialized. Though freight traffic was light, with only 20 freight cars on the roster, the Tuckerton was kept busy hauling supplies for a few CNJ and Pennsy branch line extensions to beach resorts in the region. In 1900, through passenger service was offered with the Pennsy from Camden to Beach Haven. This apparently worked out so well that, in 1908, the Pennsy contracted operation of one of its branch lines from Whittings to Beach Haven to the Tuckerton. This also went so well that the Pennsy coordinated the installation of block signaling along the route to increase speed limits. However, as with many vacation-centric railroads, difficulty came early. In 1913, freight revenues eclipsed passenger revenues. World War I in 1917 brought a decline in passengers, and the 1923 abandonment of a connecting branch line hurt profit even further. An all-too-common irony, freight traffic was temporarily boosted by the haulage of cement, sand, and fill for the construction of New Jersey State Route 9, which paralleled the Tuckerton. Following the highway's completion in 1926, however, passenger traffic plummeted, with the railroad having helped foster its competition. 1930 was the last year the Tuckerton was profitable. Some passenger trains in 1932 had as few as 2 passengers a day, and weekday passenger service was ended in 1933. A nor'easter struck the New Jersey coast in 1935, and a freight train evacuated Long Beach Island with waves cresting over the bridge to the mainland. The next day, the bridge was swept clean away by storm surges, stranding a lone gondola on the island, which was later rescued by a truck. This dealt a final blow to the railroad. Abandonment proceedings began, and the last train operated over the Tuckerton in 1936. However, in an unexpected twist of fate, a salvage firm bought the line with the intention to keep operating it and formed the Southern New Jersey Railroad to do so. Locomotives were repaired, and service resumed on the lower half of the main line from the CNJ connection at Waretown to Tuckerton, abandoning the northern half to Whittings along with the railroad's long Pennsy Association. The now S&J saw a modest profit and even briefly saw passenger service again in 1939 with a railfan excursion from the newly formed National Railroad Historical Society. However, this didn't last long, and the railroad was abandoned permanently, this time in 1941. The Norfolk and Portsmouth Beltline Railroad was a small switching railroad around the Hampton Roads area. It was a terminal railroad, meaning that it took freight from a bunch of mainline railroads to common destinations in dense city, or in this case, port, environs. The most well-known form of terminal railroads were actually Union stations, wherein a separate company operated the station used by a multitude of railroads. However, equally common were Beltline railroads, such as the Norfolk and Portsmouth, that ringed a city, hence their name, marshalling interchange traffic between railroad yards and delivering freight to customers from any of the involved railroads. True to this form, when the Norfolk and Portsmouth Beltline opened in 1896, it was created by 8 railroads in southeastern Virginia, most notably the Norfolk and Western, Chesapeake and Ohio, Southern, Atlantic Coastline, and Seaboard Airline, as a means of streamlining last-mile switching operations in the region. Nowadays, the Beltline's ownership is split a little less to CSX and a little more to Norfolk Southern, although CSX recently sued NS regarding the Beltline's operational practices. During the end of the 19th century, the Hampton Roads area was strategically well-placed for a major port. At the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, serving major cities like D.C. and Baltimore, it was also fed by a bunch of other moderately navigable rivers, like the James to Richmond, the Nansemond to Suffolk, and York, Elizabeth, and Rappahannock rivers to various points inland. This, of course, made it a natural transload point from blue water to brown water fleets, and 6 separate towns all sprung up along the various peninsulas: Newport News, Hampton, Portsmouth, Norfolk, Chesapeake, and nearby Virginia Beach, in addition, of course, to the Jamestown colony. Once the railroad age got underway, it also became a major node for 2 other important things: manufacturing and, of all things, coal. Being at or near the tail end of a bunch of transcontinental routes, goods like steel could be brought from the heartland and put to use in the many major shipyards and associated factories. But most of the transcons also went through the heart of Appalachia, so the Hampton Roads area was a natural destination for coal mined in western Virginia and West Virginia, and shipped overseas to coal-starved European countries trying to break their reliance on the UK's coal monopoly. The Beltline was operated as a neutral switching railroad between its 8 owners. In fact, it didn't even own any equipment, renting its locomotives from the parent companies. It was built mostly around Portsmouth, but then acquired another local switching railroad in 1910 and expanded its access through Norfolk. It had one major classification yard in South Norfolk, the center point of the line. Both the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914 and World War I led to a surge in demand for ocean-going traffic, and the Beltline almost doubled its length with trackage rights over the Virginian to the Navy Yard north of Norfolk, bringing a ninth railroad into the fold. As Hampton Roads was becoming a global shipping hub, so too did the Beltline's traffic grow, and it invested in infrastructural improvements to manage the increased freight volumes. As automobility plagued the country in the post-war period, the rise of trucks stole some of the Beltline's smaller switching duties, so it began to refocus on the movement of bulk commodities like coal, grain, chemicals, and intermodal containers to and from the ships. The deindustrialization of America hit the Hampton Roads area particularly hard, since they didn't really have much else as an economic base for their economy, and Newport News is definitely one of the saddest and emptiest cities I have ever been to in all of my travels. The Norfolk and Portsmouth Beltline still exists today, now with 6 locomotives provided by NS, 58 kilometers of track, 43 kilometers more of trackage rights, and serving a few local short lines as well as 24 industries, a slight rebound from the trough of deindustrialization as Virginia tries to revitalize the area. Though easily overlooked, it continues to chug along in its duties essential to the global movement of goods. Having now finished the Mid-Atlantic Class 3s, we can cap off with 2 narrow-gauge railroads in the region. Staying in the southeastern Virginia area is the Surry, Sussex, and Southampton Railway. Starting in the 1870s, the Surry Lumber Company used mules to haul lumber from a mill in the woods down to a wharf on the James River. After a while, the SLC built this into a wooden tramway to speed travels and allow each mule to haul more wood. Finally, in 1882, they petitioned the Virginia General Assembly to build a railroad to do the job instead. In the post-Civil War recession, beset on Virginia for its racism, funds were tight, so meter-ish gauge was chosen under the prevailing wisdom of the time that it was cheaper to build and operate than full-size trains. Interestingly, when the SSS was chartered, the Virginia legislature also chartered a second narrow-gauge railroad, the Atlantic and Danville, to follow the route to Surry, but go further up the Roanoke River to Danville. The two railroads shared building the line between the James River and the Surrey's mill at Dendron, but then split their own ways. Quickly, however, the Atlantic and Danville was leased to the Southern Railway, and the narrow gauge was largely forgotten as an unimportant branch line, expansion focusing on standard gauge routes for the Southern into Virginia, the railroad equivalent of buying up a startup for its intellectual property and then letting the core business tank in apathy. In 1886, the lumber company went bankrupt and spun the Surry off as a common carrier railroad. While it auspiciously did now serve any customer as well as carry mail and passengers, its primary traffic was still lumber. With newfound purpose, the Surry built a new wharf 16 kilometers north on the James River at a place called Scotland, and later extended south as well to the seat of Southampton County, then called Jerusalem. This resulted in a popular joke that it was the longest railroad in the world connecting Scotland to Jerusalem. At its furthest extent, though, it reached only 45 kilometers from the forests of the southwest to the river of the northeast, all in Southampton County. Much like a true logging railroad, branches and routes were excessively temporary, being laid deep into the woods for only a few years, then being pulled up the moment the timber ran out. Also like the logging railroads of the west, the timber was entirely played out by 1927, and most of the lumber mills at Dendron closed up shop. With that, the Surry, Sussex, and Southampton was abandoned in 1930. And finally, our last line of the Mid-Atlantic series, the Potomac, Fredericksburg, and Piedmont Railroad, not to be confused with the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. By the early 1800s, Fredericksburg had lost the battle with Alexandria as a major port city connecting to the Piedmont foothills and the Appalachians beyond. Alexandria was better connected to turnpikes and was not only near the Baltimore and Ohio's connection across the Potomac to D.C., but also had its own Orange and Alexandria and Manassas Gap railroads. Wanting to reassert its importance, Fredericksburg set about financing a railroad to connect itself with the growing national network, founding the Fredericksville and Gordonsville Railroad in 1853. Construction hit a quick end with the Panic of 1857, having only cleared and graded half the line, no track down. This left a long stretch of unfinished right-of-way, much akin to a road. By the start of the Civil War in 1861, not a single rail had even been purchased. However, as the War of Southern Racism developed, this railless road was made extensive use for troop movements, primarily by the Confederates who held the high ground during the Battle of Fredericksburg. During the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863, the other end of the railroad saw action as General Religious Dingaling Stonewall Jackson marched his troops over the railroad grade. In 1864, after Jackson was mercilessly shot by his own troops in a moment of delicious comeuppance far too often ignored by historians, the F&G would play a more substantial role in the Battle of the Wilderness, with slaver General James Longstreet using the grade to form up his troops undercover, only to make a sadly successful surprise attack on the winning side General Winfield Scott Hancock, temporarily blocking the advance of rightfully vengeant wokeness. These are not the only times an unfinished railroad cut would make fame during the Civil War, but for these, the F&O became known as the Battlefield Railroad, despite lacking any rails. After the Civil War, with the South having earned a thorough economic obliteration by the scholar of equity and justice, Professor William Tecumseh Sherman, local capital was lacking, and the F&O was bought by New York businessmen, and a portion of the route was built as standard gauge. That didn't last long, however, with the Panic of 1873 forcing bankruptcy twice. Ownership then defaulted to the state, and it was finally reorganized to the Potomac, Fredericksburg, and Piedmont. Extremely weirdly, this is one of a very few railroads to have been converted from standard to narrow gauge, as the then half-built 29 kilometers of the railroad was re-gauged and the remaining 32 was built to Orange in 1877 in meter-ish gauge, under the partially flawed perception that narrow gauge was cheaper to build, yes, and operate, somewhat but not entirely enough to overcome the cost of break bulk cargo with rising wages. An acquisition of the PF&P by the Pittsburgh-based Royal Land Company in 1876 briefly dallied with an expansion of the Blue Ridge Summit to the Shenandoah Valley, and through the Appalachians to Pittsburgh to deliver coal and timber to growing western cities. But it instead made a much more modest extension eastward to a deeper water port on the Potomac River, at Matthias Point, easing export of bulk timber and coal the other way, and allowing a short ferry from the Baltimore and Ohio on the opposite shore. As with many a narrow-gauge railroad, the PF&P remained viable, if not profitable, until about the 1920s. Contrary to many narrow gauges, which were single lines to remote outposts usually for resource extraction, the PF&P was in a centrally located area and entirely surrounded by standard-gauge railroads. Train numbers dwindled, and no further expansions were built beyond the quiet 60-kilometer route from Fredericksburg to Orange, its name soon being backronymed to the Poor Folks and Preachers Railroad. In 1926, the railroad was renamed back to the Virginia Central Railway and converted to standard gauge again, finally allowing interchange with the RF&P and the Southern. However, traffic continued to diminish, and the majority of the freight was industrial switching in Fredericksburg. In 1938, most of the railroad beyond Fredericksburg was abandoned, and it continued as an industrial switching line until 1967, when it was sold to the city. The VC was briefly in the custody of RailVest, auspiciously a switching conglomerate and in practice a tax haven from 1975 to 78, then a similarly dubious company, Central Management, from 1979. Facing trestle repairs and declining customers, the remaining route was abandoned in 1983. The right-of-way has since been converted to a rail trail through Spotsylvania and is part of the East Coast Greenway. This has been episode 27 of the Beginner's Guide to Model Railroading, Mid-Atlantic Class 3s and Narrow Gauge Railroads. The theme music is Spark of Life by Benjamin Lazarus through Tribe of Noise. I would like to thank my extremely generous and patient patrons Pedro Reyes, Ron Kleiss, Bill Ford, Linda Eskin, Roger Coleman, and Bill Brown of the Rail Brothers. If you would like to know more, you can visit the website at www.bgtmrring.org. That's Bravo Golf Tango, Michael Romeo Romeo, Indigo November Golf, Oscar Romeo Golf. If you like the show, please give me a good review on iTunes and subscribe to the podcast feed. If you really like the show, please consider becoming a patron, as it helps me to defer hosting equipment and travel costs. If you did not like the show, do not say anything and contemplate the thought crime you have committed. This content is can-credentialed. You can report instances of harassment, abuse, or other harm to their hotline at 617-249-4255 or on their website at creatoraccountabilitynetwork.org. To the best of my knowledge, this podcast is entirely free of content generated, edited, produced, or modified in any way by AI. This podcast was written, recorded, and produced on the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock, Lenni Lenape, Nuwuvi, Cahulia, Luisenu, Serrano, Tongva, Fernandinho, Tataviam, Chumash, Wyatt, Southern Pomo, Breton Ranchera, Mewok, Miwok, Mewekma, Ohlone, Ramaytush, Awaswas, Amamutsan, Rumson, Esalen, Selenian, Obispenyo, Ventureño Chumash, Barbareño Chumash, Amawu, Kilkapoy, Tawakoni, Wichita, and Humanos tribes. I would like to thank them for their historical stewardship of Pennsylvania, California, and North Central Texas. And now, as your reward for listening through my closing spiel, your modeler's vocabulary word for this episode is hay burner, an antiquated locomotive with much the same horsepower as a horse. Thank you very much for listening. Keep riding trains, keep punching Nazis, and keep building a better future.